Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Ashley Marchand-Orr, the Senior Research Manager at NACD. First of all, thank you for bearing with us through a few technical difficulties, and thank you for joining us today for our Compensation Committee webinar, How Talent Strategy and Leadership Development Can Strengthen Corporate Culture. If you attended NACD's Global Board Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. last month, you received a copy of our 2017 report of the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission on Culture as a Corporate Asset. We had some fantastic discussions with our report's commissioners about how committees and the full board can help cultivate healthy corporate culture. Our conversations specifically about the Compensation Committee yielded near consensus on two responsibilities beyond executive pay that are directly connected to culture oversight. Those are talent strategy and leadership development. Today, we're going to explore those responsibilities in greater depth. I'm joined today by Howard Brownstein, the president of NACD's Philadelphia chapter, an independent director, as well as the president and founder of turnaround management firm, the Brownstein Corporation. I'm also joined by Jan Kors, who is an NACD Governance Fellow and a faculty member for NACD's Director Professionalism and Masterclass Education Programs. Jan is also the Senior Managing Director and Western Region President at Pearl Meyer, an executive compensation consultancy. So Jan and Howard are going to lead our discussion and provide some examples of how boards and senior executives can use talent management processes and recognition and reward systems to reinforce the desired company culture. We're also going to discuss succession planning, especially as it pertains to long-term leadership development. But before we get started, Sienna Breen with our NACD education team has a few housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Ashley. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. During this presentation, you can submit questions on the right side of your screen, and our speakers will answer them if time permits. Pearl Meyer will also answer any remaining questions by email. If you submit a question, you will be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from Pearl Meyer. During the program, you can also tweet live with us using @NACD and @PearlMeyer. Today's presentation slides are available for download at the link on your screen, as well as within the webinar console on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You will automatically receive one NACD skill-specific credit for your participation in this webinar of at least 30 minutes. Credit may be applied to NACD fellowship programs. You can contact fellowships@nacdonline.org for more information. Just as a reminder, a recording of this webinar and the slide deck will be available early next week at nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. Finally, there will be a few evaluation poll questions at the very end of the presentation, and we would love your feedback. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jan, who will discuss the agenda.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashley. As we started and talked about this, when we think about the role of culture in an organization, and we've certainly seen plenty of examples in the news recently around issues of questionable culture and the impact that's had on businesses. There are two areas that specifically tend to fall within the purview of the Compensation Committee. That would be talent strategy and the talent management process, as well as the leadership development and succession planning process. And so Ashley and Howard and I would like to talk about those two items specifically this afternoon. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us on the technical issues to start. So on the talent management side, it's really about kind of how you think about the right way to bring culture into the process of the selection of your executives, as well as how you give them performance feedback and those sorts of things, both in the performance feedback process, but also then in the rewards and recognition system. And then the second item that we'd want to talk about is in the succession planning area, how you think about how culture plays a role in terms of the succession plan you have, both a near-term, what I'll call emergency break glass succession plan, as well as a longer-term sort of strategic succession plan. Let me move my slides. So on the talent management side, and Howard, I'd love to be able to kind of tap into your experience on this front. You think about culture, it's really all about the people in the organization. And you know, my take on culture is it's not the mission statement that's on a plaque on the wall somewhere. It is the collective actions that everyone takes in the organization every day. You know, the stuff on the wall is nice, but what really creates a culture in an organization is the day-to-day decisions people make, how they interact with each other, how they interact with the marketplace. And sometimes that's aligned with the words on the wall, and sometimes it's not.
Right. So, you know, just as a starting out underlying concept, and I have a feeling I'm preaching to the converted, to the folks on this call, but, you know, in many companies, the real assets go home every night. So the talent is an undermanaged asset in many companies, and particularly when it comes to the board's role, the role of the committee on the board that might be designated to manage this is expanding, and we'll talk more about that later. But when we talk about culture, it's really important to understand that we're not talking about some elusive, undefinable concept. It's not even just a qualitative concept, that there may be metrics that we'll talk about later in this presentation that are quantitative, that will help you get your arms around culture in your company, how it's changing, if it needs to change. But it all starts out with a declaration, both mentally and out loud, by the board that culture matters. One of the greatest business commentators, Peter Drucker, famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can have the best strategy, the most well-formulated strategy, but if the culture of your people isn't aligned with that, it may not happen, or it may not happen as quickly and as cheaply as you might like. So it all begins with the board deciding that culture matters. And then, as we'll talk about in today's presentation, how do you make that show up in what you do and how you think? Let me pause there.
Sure. And we put a few examples of what that looks like on the slide. You know, so it's you know, kind of, is there, when you look at the CEO, does the CEO embody the culture that you aspire to for the firm? In terms of that person's leadership style, do they walk the talk? Is the board kind of looking at that CEO and saying it's more than just delivery of the bottom line financial numbers? We care about the way in which we deliver those numbers as well, whether that's through customer satisfaction metrics or employee satisfaction metrics, but things that really say, you know, we want the bottom line results, but it matters how we get there. And, you know, the second thing that I think is always really telling is when you look beyond the CEO at the management team as a whole, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the succession planning issue, is, you know, it says a lot about the company's culture when you look at how people get rewarded. What are we willing to pay for? Do we pay for the things that we say are important? Do we treat people the way we say we want to treat people relative to our culture? And when we look at who gets ahead and who does well in the organization, as well as who fails and who, quote unquote, isn't a good fit, what does that tell us about the culture of the organization? Is it as you look at an organization and say, who succeeds and gets to the top of the organizational ladder? Is it the people who are straight arrows, nose to the grindstone, or is it the cowboys who are out there taking risks? And depending on which one of those two types of people does well tells you about your culture. And I think importantly, going back to that issue of words on a plaque on a wall, people look at those implicit signals, who gets ahead, what gets valued, who fails, why do they fail, and take much more note of those types of things than they do about the words on the wall.
This is Howard. Let me give you an image that many can remember, the famous movie Ben-Hur, in which he saw that a chariot team needed horses that on the inside could hold steady and keep the chariot on the track, and horses on the outside that could run really fast. And every organization needs some balance of different types of people for different tasks, but it doesn't happen if the company and the board don't pay attention to that.
Okay, we're seeing some really interesting questions, and around how a board can really discern culture, and or how can a board kind of start to turn a culture if they think that it's not where it should be. But as a lead into that, let's move to our first polling question, just to kind of set the stage for a discussion around how the board should really kind of dig in and what they can do, strategies they can use to understand culture, as well as strategies they can use to help shape or turn a culture. So let's move to our first polling question. Ashley, you want to read through that?
Absolutely. So our first polling question is, has your board explicitly discussed the company's culture and whether its compensation plan supports that culture? You can either choose yes, we have discussed both. We have discussed culture but not compensation's role. We haven't discussed the subject, or unsure. And Jan, Howard, any thoughts from you two based on your experience on these issues?
It's interesting. I don't know about you, Howard. I would argue that if you'd asked me that question maybe 5 years ago, my answer would have been very few boards, at least comp committees. In fairness, I'm not sitting in the full board meetings. I'm only sitting in comp committee meetings. I'd argue that beyond maybe the occasional discussion of employee satisfaction surveys or results, there wouldn't have been many of my clients that were having fulsome discussions around corporate culture writ large in the comp committee meeting. I think in the wake of what seems like just an avalanche of marketplace examples these days, Wells Fargo and Volkswagen before that, and now and Uber and and now kind of broader things in Hollywood and elsewhere around like the Weinstein companies. It's much more, I hear it much more frequently as a topic of discussion. I don't know whether you would agree with that, Howard?
Yes, this is really a relatively new thing, and it is true that too often we tend to think of it in the breach when culture was exposed to have led to some severe risks. But one of the things that the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission that wrote a report on company culture as a corporate asset brought out is that there's an opportunity to use culture proactively. Now, of course, you have to start out by finding out what it is right now. And, many board members might scratch their heads and say, well, how do I find that out? I only know what the management tells me. But that really exposes the need for boards to get to know the company better. Maybe they need to make some site visits. Maybe they need to have some opportunities to mix and mingle with the average folks in the company. Now, obviously, those board members should be careful not to give any of those subordinates any advice or instructions. That would be inappropriate. But they could certainly listen for what they're hearing about what these folks' values are. And then, of course, there's lots of metrics. How much turnover is there? Are there chat lines and blogs about the company that should be monitored? What if social media?
Howard, I'm going to, while I don't want to lose this track because I think that these are all really good kind of helpful hints for board members. Let's move to the results and see what they look like, and then we can keep chatting about kind of how a board really kind of gets its handle around what the current, because I think, I saw a question about how does the board help to influence change in a corporate culture, and I think in order to know whether the corporate culture is good or bad or needs to be changed, you kind of have to have a really good handle on where your starting point is. So interestingly, you got about, almost even Steven between, yes, we've actually talked about both the company's culture and the compensation and the alignment of the compensation, or yes, we've talked about culture, but we haven't really talked about kind of that compensation alignment, with only 20% or 25% saying either we haven't discussed it or we're not sure. So that's actually pretty good. So to your point, Howard, certainly those conversations are starting to happen. Ashley, you said you wanted to throw in a question here.
Absolutely. We had an audience question asking about something that I think we'll discuss in a little bit, but also just looking at the committee structure and why is this something that the compensation committee specifically should be paying attention to versus, for example, the non-gov committee?
Interesting. Actually, I'm going to move to the next slide because that actually addresses a little bit of that issue in terms of, when you think about whether or not you feel like the board has a responsibility towards talent management and leader development, the majority of companies say yes, and to the question about where should that really reside, just short of half of the respondents to our survey said it really is a full board thing. It's not a committee responsibility. But for those that broke it into a committee responsibility, it was actually about half and half. About a quarter of companies said it belongs in the comp committee. About a quarter of companies said it belongs in the nom-gov committee. Howard, I think you can speak to this as well. For myself, obviously I'm a compensation consultant, so everything looks like a comp committee issue to me. As I look at the survey results, I would say I agree that in practice, the whole thing is the culture thing is big enough that it falls into the same category as business strategy, which you wouldn't give to a single committee either. I think leadership strategy and culture is also big enough that it's a full board responsibility. But I think that sometimes, just given the precious amount of time and all of the stuff that a full board has to pay attention to, some of these things I think can get more attention in terms of the deep dive and moving the ball forward on things if there is a committee that kind of takes point. I'd argue that for a lot of this, because there is such a link to the compensation side of things, that for many companies that natural point committee is the compensation committee rather than the nom-gov committee, but, if you pushed me on it, I could probably make an argument either way. Howard, what have you seen?
Yeah, this is Howard. I agree with you. I think that it probably is the comp committee. I think like most things boards are charged with doing, there ought to be a committee responsible for doing the deeper dive. But as we all know, there are very few things that committees have an authority to do on their own. Mostly they recommend and report back to the board. So culture is definitely one of those things that the board as a whole should discuss. When I'm faced with decisions about which committee should do something, I consider what the charter to the committee say, and do those charters need to be revised. I consider who's on the committee and whether they are the right people for this potentially expanded role. And also I look at how busy they are. Maybe they already have enough on their plate, and it would be unfair to charge them with something else, and we ought to get a different group involved. So there's no one right answer. The main thing is someone should do it.
Yeah. So I wanted to move to the polling slide, Howard. I had sort of stopped, and we were talking about, and because there have been a number of questions about how does a committee, or a board, when you only get there, when you're only on site 4 or 5 times a year, and we all know that when the board is in town and at the corporate headquarters, everybody's on their best behavior. Everybody's spent days practicing their presentation to the board. So that's not a real picture of what life is like at the company. How does a board really understand culture? And it's sort of that same way when you think about, whether you look at Volkswagen or Wells Fargo or other examples, how does a board really know what's happening at the core, kind of the culture at the core, below the level of the executives that they see every day? How do you really know what's going on? Because how are you supposed to have oversight and judgment and judge the senior executives on it if you don't really know? So what are your helpful hints for really knowing what's going on at a company?
So a phrase I'm fond of quoting is that it's a process, it's not an event. This is not a once-and-done job. And how you do it is going to vary based on the company and where it is and how widely dispersed its operations are and what management is like. Among the things you can do, and I don't think any one of them is sufficient, is you want to certainly interest yourself in the statistics. Who's leaving? Why did they leave? Did anyone interview them? Who's monitoring the hotline for any complaints or whistleblowings? Is there any social media chatter out there about the company? And is anyone monitoring that? Does the company have social events for its staff that board members could attend? Again, with the admonition that they shouldn't be telling employees what they should do. It's not appropriate. But they can get to know them and listen. Obviously, you're not going to ask an employee at the Christmas party, is there anything illegal going on? But you might simply listen. But you might simply listen to how they talk and what kind of training they're getting. Training, by the way, is another area where you learn culture. What's in the training? Is training a continuous process where employees get trained about some of the recent developments? We've certainly seen recent developments in what's okay in the marketplace, in the office. And, we need to educate our employees about that so that they know and don't inadvertently make a misstep. So there's no one thing you do and you tailor it, but you start out by declaring you want to do it. You declare that we're interested in culture. Culture matters. And get into a conversation at the board level and with management about how you can educate yourself and stay educated. There's not going to be one formula for every company.
That's a really interesting point, Howard. And I'm going to put up the second polling question, but then I'd like to have a discussion about how, whilst people are answering the poll, I'd like to have a discussion about kind of how a board broaches that. So, Ashley, you want to read our polling question, and then, Howard, I'm going to come back to you in a second.
Absolutely. So our second polling question is, does your board have a formally stated talent development philosophy? Either yes, no, or unsure.
And, because one of the questions that came across, Howard, was from somebody who said, and I think you had started down that path, how do you even bring it up? If the board hasn't had that culture discussion amongst themselves or with the senior management team, how do you sort of stick your nose under that tent without having senior management feel like you're second-guessing them or trying to micromanage?
Well, of course, again, every company is different. If you feel that it won't upset or offend anybody to simply bring it up or put it on the agenda, you can. If you want to give management a heads up, hey, at our next meeting, I'd like to discuss the following. Please be thinking about it and be prepared to talk about it. You can certainly distribute among your board members one of the great publications by NACD, including the Blue Ribbon Commission report. It's another reason why companies should be full board members of NACD, because you get this stuff every day in your mailbox. And so it makes such discussions easy. And if you were to share with management, subject to NACD's copying policies, this Blue Ribbon Commission report, and say, hey, take a look at this. This is an issue that's coming more alive with corporate governance. What do you think? And let's talk about it at the board meeting. I think you'll invite people into a dialogue that can be very helpful. Now, will some companies be resistant? Sure. But if you have a company that's resistant to discussing new ideas, you may have a bigger problem than you thought you had, or you may have risk issues in other areas. What else do they not want to discuss? That's a cultural trait. Is the company open to discussing new ideas? One of my personal heroes was Mayor Ed Koch, because he would walk around the streets of New York saying, how am I doing? How am I doing? And people would come up to him and bend his ear. And some of them were flaky, and some of them had a real point to make. And the main point was that he was open to it. No, was he a politician? Sure. Was some of it for show? I guess so. But what about leadership that is always open to constructive criticism? How cool would that be? Whereas, there are some folks that they always got to be the smartest people in the room, and you can't tell them anything. I get it, and they might be very good, but it's a risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we asked the question, does your board have a formal stated talent development philosophy? And I think, Howard, one of the points you made was around whether or not, there was training and those sorts of things around understanding the impact that has on culture and what that says about your organization. Now here, interestingly, you've got about 30% of companies say, yes, we have a stated talent development philosophy. More than 50% say no, and a number of folks not sure. What do you take away from that?
It's an area of opportunity. I would ask our listeners to take the case that if they find themselves in the no category, as more than 50% did, take the case that there's nothing wrong here. You're right where you are supposed to be. Go from here. Don't make yourself wrong. Just look at it as an opportunity and figure out, okay, what next? How important is our talent? How do we treat it? What are we doing or not doing? What else could we do? And if you're completely unsure, maybe you get an outside resource. I'm a great advocate of boards bringing in outside resources. I'm not getting paid for this commercial, but Pearl Meyer is such a resource. And there are other resources that you could bring in to advise you, give you some ideas. You could certainly talk to NACD. It provides board advisory services. So there's any number of things you can do. It all starts with the will to do it, to inquire, to being open. And it's an opportunity.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, as I look at this, so is it so bad to say we don't really have a stated talent development philosophy? And, you probably get by. The question is, are you really kind of optimizing your business strategy? Because, when I think about how that talent development philosophy and leadership strategy plays into the ability to deliver on a business strategy, if you say, well, the business strategy is what says what the company is going to do, and we would never operate a company that didn't have a business strategy, and most boards go through a process every single year where they've got a strategic offsite, or management is putting a 3-year plan in front of them. We're talking about where the business goes. So boards are very intimately involved in the business strategy, and yet in order to fully deliver on that strategy, you got to know that you've got the talent underneath it or behind it that's necessary to deliver on it. So I think in order to really effectively deliver on that business strategy, you got to know the talent side of it to go along with it. I mean, we're in football season, and I'm a big football fan, so I'll use my football analogy, which is, think about a coach that comes in, and, coach comes in, has been at another team, has a playbook that he uses, that he loves, that has worked for him in the past. If that coach doesn't look around and say, but do I have the talent to actually deliver on this playbook, or do I have to come up with a different set of plays that takes advantage of the skills I actually have on my team? And I think there's an iterative process there that every good senior leadership team has to go through, and the board can be really helpful in kind of stress testing that.
Absolutely. Look, I am not here to say that the people on this call, listening on this webinar, cannot do their duty without thinking about talent. What I'm saying is, if you don't, it's a risk. And it's a risk that you can easily address. And each company will be different based on the type of talent you have and how big your bench is right now, et cetera, et cetera. The main thing is to think about it. And there may be ways to improve your value and reduce your risk. That's what governance does. Good governance reduces risk and increases value. Does it bulletproof a company against problems? Absolutely not. Does it make chances better? I really think so.
Yep. So I want to move into some tactical things that fall into the category that fall clearly within the purview of the Compensation Committee. I mean, we talked about whether or not this kind of broader topic of culture and talent management is a comp committee thing, a nom-gov committee thing, or a full board thing, but certainly the subset of this area that talks about kind of recognition and rewards systems clearly falls within the purview of the comp committee. And so here, let's talk a little bit about how we think about the overlay of culture into the compensation issues, and how compensation design, if done well, supports a company's culture, and if done poorly, can actually drive bad behavior, which can harm a company's culture.
Sure. So I'll interject. So in my opinion, for example, all pricing is information. If you know that your supermarket runs specials on Wednesday, you're going to go on Wednesday if you can, if it matters to you. If we were to pay salesmen double commission on odd number days of the month and zero commission on even number days of the month, they would learn how to sleep 24 hours and do all their sales on odd number days. If you have an incentive plan that's on an annual bonus basis, if come October or November the people don't think they're going to hit the threshold to earn the bonus, believe me, they're going to think about pushing sales into next year so that they'll be likelier to get it next year. Now, all this is because of the information you gave in how you pay them. So in my day job as a turnaround professional, it's not uncommon. I encounter what I just described. And what I'll do is push the reset button and put into place some shorter-term incentives to get everybody more excited and thinking they're able to get some incentive compensation. Now, is that a cure-all? Absolutely not. But it's one thing you can do. You start out by saying, what is our compensation system telling people? Is it aligned with our strategy? And how do I know? And do I need help in figuring that out? As I said, there are resources to help you. But that's how you think about it, and that's how it begins to be a tool, a lever you can pull regarding culture.
And Jan, while we're talking about recognition and rewards, I am curious, we've got a note there about non-financial rewards. Can you give us an example of what that might be?
Well, it's interesting because, when the knee-jerk reaction to say, well, how do we incorporate, culture into the incentive system is to immediately go say, oh, well, we need to put in, employee satisfaction metrics or turnover metrics or customer service metrics. And I think Howard just made a really interesting point, which is it's not just those non-financial metrics that send the organization a message about culture. The financial metrics you use, the choices you make about sales versus profit margin or return on capital, the amount of stretch that you put in your budget or target metrics, the amount of leverage you use when you set thresholds and maximums, all of those things send a message to the organization about your corporate culture as well. And I think it's really important to understand that when you start thinking about the linking and the alignment between compensation programs and corporate culture, alignment doesn't just mean, oh, well, we put an employee satisfaction metric in our bonus plan, so now we're aligned. It permeates the entire program. You got to think about, what do the metrics that we chose, even the financial metrics, say about which types of metrics are important to the organization? What does the leverage in the plan and the goal setting say about how hard charging that we want executives to be and how much stretch there is in our goal setting process? What is the pay mix in the organization, the difference between how much is fixed sort of salary versus how much is short-term incentives versus how much is long-term incentive, says something about how we feel about risk-taking in the organization and long-term versus short-term focus. And all of those things speak to a piece of the company culture. So you're sending messages about culture even if you're not talking about quote-unquote soft non-financial metrics. But to get to your point, Ashley, I think there are some ways you can think of the worry that I often hear around putting in non-financial metrics is that, well, then I'll lose the alignment between incentive payout and performance results, and then shareholders will get mad. I'll get a bad ISS recommendation. And I think that the question is the issue is kind of being smart about the measures, the non-financial measures you choose. I'll make a plug for a prior NACD Blue Ribbon Commission report. A few years ago, we did a BRC on performance measurement. It wasn't solely about compensation. It was really about kind of how companies measure performance just in general. But certainly there was a lot of discussion amongst the commissioners around performance measurement as it aligned to compensation. And that BRC actually had some great examples in appendix materials about non-financial performance metrics, how you think about them, what you use them for. I would simply kind of, in summary, say I think about kind of choosing non-financial metrics around making sure that they're really meaningful leading indicators. In many respects, financial measures are by definition backwards looking because you are measuring performance that's already occurred. And if you marry them the right way, those non-financial metrics, doesn't mean non-quantifiable, just means non-P&L based. Those non-financial metrics can marry up quite nicely with those lagging indicators to be leading indicators. So, if you are I'll use as an example a retail company, revenues, sales is an important measure of performance. Well, a really good leading indicator can be things like return customers, can be things like number of multi-unit sales, can be things like, so you can start to say there are things, if I start losing repeat customers, that has a potential impact on my future sales results. So it's a really good leading indicator. R&D stuff in a pharmaceutical company can be a really good leading indicator of future financial performance. So when I think about those things, they can kind of marry with financial results really well, and leading indicators also kind of bolster what we're talking about in terms of culture and sending a message to incentive participants about what are the things that you should be doing that will lead to financial results. So if we think that R&D is really important in a pharmaceutical company, we're actually as a corporation willing to put our money where our mouth is on that. If we think multi-unit sales or return customers is really important to the sustainability of our companies, of our retail companies' revenues, then we say to the organization, we think this is important enough that we're actually willing to pay you more money for getting those sales the right way.
That's great. Actually, I think that's a fantastic segue to our next polling question, if you'd like to take that.
Okay, we'll put that up.
Wonderful. So the next polling question for our audience is, has the board identified non-financial goals that are critical to the company's ongoing success? Either yes, no, or unsure.
Yeah, and I think, Howard, I don't know to what extent, do you think when you start thinking about those non-financial goals, how have you thought about in your companies on the board about whether or not those non-financial goals are actually goals that you would put into an incentive plan and pay people for, be willing to put money behind, versus, no, we kind of expect them to do it?
Right. So here's how these might be useful. You might not say, okay, folks, we're going to pay you X dollars for every percentage point of satisfaction that customers report, for example, or that employees report, because it's not that good a measure that you'd want to be so explicit. But if you have part of the compensation that is subjective, that is a range, and you're going to award a bonus within a certain range, seeing some of these non-quantitative measures looking good might influence you to go to the higher part of that range, or vice versa. So it's a total picture, and you want to take into account both the hard data that you get, that may be the way you did things traditionally, but also the non-quantitative data that are nonetheless useful. Because if your employees booked great numbers this quarter, but you know that you upset a lot of your customers and they're unlikely to repeat, it wouldn't be a very good idea to pay too much for that because you're going to give it back. So you might be better off having all the information you can get that informs you about how your people are doing. So that's where I believe some of these non-quantitative measures can be useful.
Absolutely. So if we look at the results, has the board identified non-financial goals that are critical to the company's ongoing success? The answer is yes, and that's great. I mean, to me, what that says is, is that this kind of feeds to that business strategy and the board's role in understanding the company's business strategy. Because a lot of what's in a business strategy isn't just what we're going to do, but it's the how we're going to do it. And those non-financial goals are the things that are the how. What are the steps, the interim steps we're going to take to get to the end game? What are those things that we use that distinguish ourselves and our unique value proposition to the marketplace? How are we going to measure if things are going according to plan? And all of those kind of fall into that non-financial goal rubric. So this is actually a really good result in my book. With our last 10 minutes, I want to shift gears just slightly and talk about succession planning, because we've talked about kind of culture and the talent management side, and both in terms of how you think about measuring performance, as well as how you think about rewarding performance. And that's with the current management team. I want to talk a little bit about next generation management teams and how culture plays into succession planning. And I'll start off briefly, Howard, and then let you chime in on your experiences. From my experience, what I see in boardrooms is that companies are really good about that first tier of succession plan, which is, everybody's got the emergency break glass succession plan in a drawer, where we know if somebody leaves tomorrow for whatever reason, we know where the backfills are, we know who's going to take over, we know what our bench strength looks like, we know where we'd have to go outside to fill the gaps. And I think everybody's got, the companies I see all have, org charts with ready now, ready soon candidates, gaps, et cetera, and they're all very good. Where I don't necessarily see companies spending a lot of time talking is on what I will call a strategic or future cast succession plan, which says, what if we roll things forward 5 years? Then what does the succession plan look like? Because in reality, our business may look very different 5 years from now. In fact, our business strategy says our business is going to look different 5 years from now. How will the org chart change? Some of the people that we've got in ready now positions, 5 years from now will not be candidates for succession. They will have retired. They will have moved on. So what does that next gen succession plan looks like? And companies are less good about that in a broad sense, in my experience. But Howard, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how culture plays into succession planning.
Well, it's very important for a board to look at its role as a moving picture, not as a snapshot. What is valuable for today may not help you tomorrow or next year or 5 years. And since it takes time to recruit and onboard good people and make sure they're the right people and have them totally inculcated, you really want to be taking a long view of succession planning. Assuming the company's going to be here a while, and presumably it would, then I agree with you, and we should be thinking about not just today's succession plan, but what happens later. And the more you can do about that, the easier your job will be down the road. The less you'll have to scramble when something unexpected comes up, or people rotate out in the normal course of business. So I subscribe to what you said.
And just as a wrap-up, I would say that kind of brings me full circle to one of the earlier comments, which is if you think about succession planning and you think about kind of what message are we sending to the organization about the culture of the organization when you look at who is filling those senior-most leadership positions in the company and who gets ahead and who gets promoted. Do they walk the talk? Do they embody what we hope to be the culture of our organization? Do they, in aggregate, as a group, kind of fit that mold? And how does the message about who we tap for those as the next generation of leadership, what does that tell the rest of the organization about the culture and the type of person that we think best embodies the culture of the company? So to wrap up here, I would say the takeaways for us are that, as I think I said when we started, if the business strategy is the thing that defines what the company does, then culture and leadership is how the company is going to do it. And the board clearly has a responsibility for both of those things. So it's important that the board really understand the distinct characteristics that defines the company's unique culture. What is it that makes us different than the competitor across the street or the company down the road? As you think about how that plays into talent management and leadership development, on the talent management side, it's thinking about those culture metrics. And both in terms of just is the board getting regular, fulsome information and reporting about those things so that you really start to try to get an understanding of what's going on in the organization below just the top level of executives that you see and talk to when you're in board meetings. And then secondarily, there's a decision about the extent to which you believe that those culture metrics are important enough that they ought to be weaved into the incentive plan or the performance measurement system in some way. On the leadership side, I think culture plays into thinking about kind of not just has the person that we're promoting, are we promoting them just because they hit their numbers and, they deliver on their business plan? Have we thought about the impact of of our leaders' personal leadership styles? Do they walk the talk? Do they embody the culture of the organization? Do they represent the company and the company's values both to other employees as well as to the marketplace in general? And have we thought about how the changing and the change in the organization and the future business of the organization potentially impacts what we need on the talent front and the leadership front in terms of both how the organization chart looks and what seats need to be filled, as well as what type of individual do we need to fill them. And with that, I am right up at time.